Until recently, I lived in a private house with my parents. They have always been characterized by a strict temperament and difficult character, so we had guests almost never. The only one of my friends with whom my parents were able to get along a little was Lyoka. I had known him since first grade, and he was probably the only one I could fully trust in a difficult situation. Unlike my parents, who found it easier to scold me for my mistakes than to teach me not to make them, Lyoka was always ready to help. He had much more worldly experience than I did. He grew up without a father, worked from the age of 14, and even had time to go out with girls. One thing he was unlucky about was his mother was an alcoholic. Half of the alimony she drank away, and the second bought Lyosha food. But still he had what I could only dream of as a child: freedom. A year after he came of age, his mother died, so Lyosha got the apartment. A week ago, he came to visit me in the evening. His parents went to the theater, so the house was at our disposal for the next 3 hours. We didn't even think about any parties, because we knew how it could turn out. It made no sense to organize them in Lehigh's apartment. Despite my age, 19 years old, my father was categorically against my sleepovers somewhere outside the house. That's why I took my friend's idea of buying an inexpensive apartment on the outskirts of the city very positively. All fire Lyoka, but to save from pocket money for an apartment. It is, of course, powerful. I can hardly buy a decent house, I said. You can, smiled Leka. Not only decent, but also new in new buildings. Then I'd rather have a house. My voice sounded upset. I'm serious, said Lyoka firmly. Everything has already been invented. My neighbor recently pulled off a similar scheme, now lives and is happy. Look, your money is enough for an apartment in an old 5-story building on the outskirts. It was built poorly, the foundation was badly laid, the house sagged. Now there's a crack along the wall and there's mold and the heating went down. The house was recognized as an emergency and under the new program is being prepared for demolition, and the residents will be relocated to new buildings. See where I'm going with this? And the owner is some kind of major, he doesn't need the apartment for nothing. He'll give it away for a penny. Well, and if what happens, we with the guys will lend you up to the full amount, he smiled. But we have to hurry. They'll ban buying apartments there some time before demolition. Are you offering me to live in a shithole, which at any moment can collapse on my head? Come on, cut Lyoka, you live there for less than a month, will not have time to collapse. And as soon as they move in, you and I will have a housewarming party. Well, how do you like the motivation? I told him I'd think about it and give my decision tomorrow afternoon. I had to discuss everything with my parents and, if they agreed, to prepare myself for the purchase. The conversation was long. I gave a lot of arguments and explained Lehin's plan several times. After a decent amount of time, my mother still supported me, followed by my father. I was happy, and the next day I went to Lyoka's place. The rent was a little less than the amount I had saved up. My family was very wealthy, my parents were not stingy on pocket money, and I was modest and knew how to save money. And I had nowhere to spend it, except to treat Lyoka in a cafe or once a year to buy myself new clothes. Also in the course went accumulated from lousy part-time job stock. The last year I, running away from parental care, on weekends dragged with Lyoka on various shabashki. The seller turned out to be an adequate young guy, a little older than me and Lyoka. He got the apartment from his grandmother, whom he did not know, so he had no warm feelings for the apartment and put it up for sale as soon as possible. The apartment was located on the 4th floor. The front iron door stood out nicely against the background of the shabby and painted walls, but behind it was not the best sight. Inside was a disgusting mess, as if all the neighborhood cats had taken a dump here. In some places the wallpaper was peeling off in shreds, and instead of the chandeliers I was used to seeing, the rooms were lit by dim bulbs sticking out of dust-covered black sockets on ghastly wires. In the corner of the kitchen window, a scotch-taped crack glistened. In the big room stood the sold-out sofa on which the grandmother had rested. We immediately packed it up and covered it with a sheet. In the second room, smaller, there was a closet, a bed, and a nightstand. Well, we can live, smiled Lyoka. And you cannot stay at your place? I asked, looking at the stained linoleum in the room. The apartment is registered for me, which means that I'll be moved anyway. I don't have to live here. There's such a thing, he hesitated. I don't live alone. Remember Liska from the second group? Everything became clear. I'd have to live here. At least here I had all the comforts, and the iron door protected me from the outside world. My conscience didn't allow me to go to my parents' house for the night, and I didn't want to see my father's smirk, disappointed by his son's helplessness and unpreparedness for independent life. Toward evening, we moved my things from my parents, and Lyoka went home. I had only tap water for dinner, so I decided to go grocery shopping. The 5-story building stood far away from the other houses, so it took a little more than 15 minutes to get to the store. When I returned, it was dark outside and the streetlights were on. Outside my driveway, I noticed a silhouette. A little hesitant, I decided to say hello. "Who are you?" the silhouette asked. "I live here now." I was confused. The silhouette put out his cigarette and approached me. It was a woman of short stature, middle-aged, well-preserved for her age, but with a hoarse, smoky voice. "Ludmila," she extended her hand. "Sergey. How long have you been here, Sergey?" "I moved in today, and you?" "All my life." "Wow." I stretched out. "Have you heard, by the way, that they want to demolish the house?" "I heard. The officials think that we can easily throw us out of here. They promise us new houses, but they will give us a bed in a hostel at best." Ludmila started talking. "But that's not the case. I'll still live here, even if this crack goes all the way through my apartment." "Is there a lot of people living here?" I asked out of politeness. "No, it's just me and Boris Anatolievich. He used to serve in the Navy, and they gave him this apartment for his length of service. Then his daughter and her family died in an accident, so he's the only one left here. He lives on the 5th floor." We talked for a couple of minutes until another silhouette appeared from the darkness of the courtyard. His posture was straight and his step was firm, but the limp on one leg and heavy breathing gave him away as an old man. "Meet Boris Anatolievich, Sergey." Ludmila nodded toward the silhouette. The man stepped into the light. It was an elderly, gray-haired man. I extended my hand to him, but there was no response. His eyes were troubled, and he glanced at the windows of the house, obviously terribly worried about something, and then he stared at me and said sternly, "Lock the doors at night." "Doors?" I asked him again. The old man did not answer and silently hurried up the stairs. Ludmila and I looked at each other. We felt uneasy. After a while, we went to our apartments. The request with the doors puzzled me. At night, I closed the iron door on all revolutions, and also the wooden door leading to my room on a small bolt. I couldn't sleep for a long time. My thoughts were interfering with the new place, and the old man wouldn't leave my mind. Miasmas, I thought, and calmed down. In the night, I was awakened by a noise from the apartment above, as if they were moving heavy furniture on the floor. Then footsteps, a terrible rumble. The last straw was the sharp clink of something glass shattering on the floor. I got out of bed and knocked on the radiator, and everything went quiet. The rest of the night passed quietly. In the morning before the institute, I met Ludmila at the entrance and politely inquired about the apartment above me. She, smiling, replied, "Boris Anatolievich's apartment, I told you. There are 2 of us left here." I thought to myself, and smiling back, I went to my studies. The day went as usual. After class, I stopped by Lyoka's place. He introduced me to Lisa, and I stayed there until evening. I returned home late, already under the light of the street lamps. The silhouette stood in front of the entrance again. "How was your day, Ludmila?" I smiled at my neighbor. She did not answer, but only looked at me fearfully. "Something happened?" "Sergey, I do not know." Her voice trembled. Almost stammering from fear, she continued, "I just came back from work, stood here smoking, and then suddenly I look at my window, and there the light turned on." She swallowed and exhaled. "And then one, and it was off. Maybe there's someone out there." "Come on." I smiled. The house is more years old than you and I are together, so the wiring is acting up. Would you like me to come in and check it out? If it's not too much trouble, Sergey, she said, a little calmer, and handed me the keys. How I cursed myself for this, but it was too late to retreat. I had pepper spray with me, which gave me a little confidence. The door to Ludmila's apartment was closed. With a trembling hand, I turned the key, entered, and quickly turned on the hallway light. No one was there. I checked the kitchen, then the hall and bedroom empty. I opened the kitchen window and shouted to Ludmila. She looked up, smiled with relief, and came into the entryway. She offered to drink tea and sit at her place, but I politely declined and wandered back to my apartment. About an hour passed. I sat at my laptop and watched the show. The window in the room was fully open, and I could hear everything that was going on outside, whether it was the voices of alkies passing by or the sounds of cars passing somewhere far away. Suddenly, I heard a woman scream. I jumped up from my seat out of fright, looked out the window, no one. Again the scream. Now I realized it was coming from our house. Everything came together in my head. I felt cold. My body felt as if it were one big piece of ice. Only Ludmila could be screaming, I thought, but who could have heard her? It's not like I heard anyone come into the entryway. And if no one did not come in, oh my God, there was someone inside. But where? I checked everything. I froze for a moment. My eyes opened so wide they looked like they were about to fall out. My breath hitched. I didn't check the bathroom. The nasty thought slapped against the crust of my brain and left its sticky residue there. When the stupor let go, I hurriedly turned off the lights in the room, grabbed my phone, and stood at the window, covering myself with the curtain so I could see who was coming out of the entryway and, if necessary, identify the perpetrator to the police. Called 02. The dispatcher reported that the squad had already left. The police beaver arrived in 10 minutes. I was surprised at such haste and very happy, because during all this time no one had come out of the entrance. 3 policemen ran into the house, and 1 stayed outside. I waved to him and gave him the number of the apartment so that the policeman could take my statement. There was a knock at the door. It was 2 operatives. They wrote down everything I told them, and then invited me to Ludmila's apartment. Her body was lying in the bathtub. A trail of blood stretched from the bathtub to the kitchen window. She probably wanted to call for help. The cause of death was not determined on the spot. No wounds, blood was just pouring out of her mouth, and the nails on her hands were broken, as if she had fought with someone before her death. According to police, the door had to be forced open. It was locked and had no signs of forced entry, which means that the perpetrator had keys, thanks to which he gained access to Ludmila's apartment. The investigator assumed that the murderer left the building through the attic, crossed the roof to another entrance, and went out the door, which is on the opposite side of the house from my window. The investigator left his number and left. Ludmila's body was soon taken away. It was unbearably creepy and morally hard to spend the night alone. I called Lyoka and suggested that he come to my place. He arrived reluctantly. The night passed as it always did. We went to bed late. About 4 o'clock, I heard a familiar rumbling, a low, quiet voice, and loud footsteps. Sure enough, the old man started jumping on the spot. After 5 minutes, it stopped and I fell asleep. At breakfast, Lyoka shared his impressions after the overnight stay. Not only that you put me to sleep on the floor, I could not sleep half the night because of it, but also some idiot jumps midnight me out of sleep. Did you hear that too? I smiled. It's my upstairs neighbor, the moronic grandfather. Upstairs neighbor? So you have a psychotic grandfather living here, and you make me go to your place in the middle of the night and climb a dark staircase? What if he killed a woman? I shuddered. Nightmarish images appeared in my head as the grandfather comes down to Ludmila, opens the door, hides in the bathroom, and waits until the defenseless woman is home alone and decides to take a shower after a hard day's work. Did you tell the cops about him? Saved me from the intracranial horror movie-like voice. What's the point? I justified myself. They'll start questioning him, and he'll move the nightstand in front of them. I was asked how many tenants in the house. I said 2. You're not lying. He's a sick man. On the first day, he came to me and said, "Close the doors at night." Ludmila told me that his whole family had died in an accident, and that's when things started to move. Well, as you know, Lyoka shrugged his shoulders. He finished his coffee, pushed the mug away and thought, "You told me yesterday that you thought about the bathroom, like the killer was sitting there, and now I thought about it and I realized that, close the doors at night, what is this about?" I got worried. "When you left, this woman," continued Lyoka, "heard that she closed the door exactly on the lock." "I don't remember," I admitted. Lyoka raised his eyebrows and stared at me creepily. "Enough." I waved away. First warned, then killed, and then locked the door so that no one would guess. He could barely breathe, and he wasn't even capable of murder. The day passed quickly. There were only 2 classes, so I came home early. Her brother had come to Ludmila's apartment. I met him on the landing and asked him about their family. He told me that Luda had never had a husband or children. She had been unlucky in life. He lived in another city and had come here for his sister's funeral. I spent the rest of the day at home, watching a TV series, went to bed early. My mood was bad. At night, I was awakened again by a noise from upstairs. This time they were jumping more often and harder, as if trying to pierce the floor with their feet. I managed to fall asleep. I got up very early. Leka's words did not get out of my head. Was grandfather really capable of something like that? I decided to call the investigator, thinking that he would call me to the department, but the investigator arrived an hour later. When I told him about my suspicions, he decided to interrogate the old man and called the staff. They arrived quickly and told me to go upstairs with them as an interrogator. They knocked for a long time, but Boris didn't open the door. Then the investigator, rubbing his tired red eyes, ordered one of the policemen to break down the flimsy wooden door. Without a warrant. He smiled. "We'll write it out later," the investigator muttered. Behind the door was a well-maintained apartment, with a beige doormat with brown inlays along the corridor and portraits of young Boris Anatolievich and his family hanging on the walls. The investigator pulled the handle of the closed door to the bedroom. It creaked open, and we entered the room. Boris Anatolievich's pale body was sitting in a chair in front of a huge mirror, with gray hair lying around him, as if torn from his head, and shards of something glassy, stained with blood. The old man's eyes were open, staring at the reflection of the door in the mirror. The dead man was looking right at us. The investigator called an ambulance and the old man was taken away. I stayed home, didn't go to the university. I called Lyoka, but he didn't pick up. I felt lonely and creepy. At night, I closed all the doors and windows, went to bed with the lamp on and miraculously fell asleep. It was dawning. I opened my eyes, looked at the ceiling and thought. Suddenly, I heard a familiar rumbling, jumping and fast running in the apartment above. Now it's jogging in the mornings, I thought. The realization of the situation came in a couple of seconds. Almost choking with horror, I jumped out of bed and with trembling hands dialed the police number. Time dragged on mockingly long. When the noise from upstairs subsided, I heard a police car rushing up the stairs. The apartment was searched, no one was there. The policeman agreed to stay with me until I left. I got dressed very quickly. In a hurry, I packed my laptop, money, and passport. In a panic, I even forgot where I threw my cell phone, so I had to dial it from my home phone, which I had never used until then. On the way to Lyoka, the investigator told me about the results of my grandfather's autopsy. It turns out that he had been dead for 3 days at least, so he was killed the night he told me about the doors. Devastated, I went to Lyoka's house and sat in his yard until evening. When Lyoka came home from the institute, we decided to take 3 of our friends with us and get my remaining things from the apartment. The street lights started to come on as we approached the house. It was frankly a bad idea to go in the evening. At the driveway, I shifted my gaze to my windows. The lights turned on for a moment and then went out. I almost fainted. I don't remember how we got home. Lyosha says that I shouted to everyone to get away from that house and run. Now I live with Lyosha, waiting for the demolition of the house. And yesterday I found on my cell phone the second missed call from the home phone of my apartment. I threw away the SIM card along with the receiver. It's not my problem anymore. The landlady turned out to be an overweight woman in an eye-catching red coat and a tangled chignon on top of her head. Her face, already not young and covered with a thick layer of powder, breathed bitchiness. Though when Zinaida Pavlovna opened her mouth, Dima realized that bitchiness was not limited to it. "Are you sure you have money, student?" she asked disdainfully. "I work after classes. I know your part-time jobs as a student. They pay you 2 pennies, and then you beg me for a rent deferment." Her left eyebrow arched upward in an arc of discontent. "The money for the apartment will be paid on time," Dima answered glumly. "Well, look at me." Zinaida was the first to step into the living room, loudly clacking her boot heels on the swollen wooden parquet. She circled the small room with her hand. Yes, it wasn't a royal palace, but it was close to the subway. Dima swallowed, and a panicky thought flashed in his head. Maybe it's not worth it? There was a sofa in the middle of an empty room and a heavy red carpet with some intricate plant pattern hanging on the wall. There was nothing else. Further inspection of the apartment did not reveal any pluses of this property either: rusty plumbing, mold on the chip tiles, and bone-chilling cold in all the rooms. But Dima could not afford anything else for his modest means, and he still had to agree to the available living space. Zinaida only stretched her plump lips in a crooked smile when she heard his answer. "No climbing on the mezzanine and under the bathroom. There's junk from past tenants and paint for repairs. Don't touch anything. Don't you ever steal anything from me. Did I make myself clear? Eh?" the landlady said threateningly, having already hidden the rent money somewhere under her bra strap and headed for the exit. Dima could only nod sluggishly, and in a minute the front door slammed shut, leaving him alone with the dusty carpet and the smell of dampness hanging in the air. If it weren't for the convenient location of this old dormitory and the relatively low rent, the guy would never have agreed to live in such a place. He wistfully remembered his hometown and his parents' house, where it was always dry, warm, and smelled of his mother's baked goods. But now he was grown up, earning his own money, and it was time for him to start his own life. What a pity that he started it in such a doghouse. Since then, Dima, every morning and evening, coming home, enjoyed a greasy stove, peeling wallpaper in all the rooms, and a small handful of cockroaches under the sink in the kitchen, which had obviously lived there for a long time and were not going to move anywhere. All attempts to clean the place only resulted in the dirt being smeared over a larger area, and the dust that had been kicked up from the place was constantly fluttering in the air. The first days, the guy was so tired at the university and at work that he fell on the creaky sofa and fell into a deep sleep until the alarm clock, trying not to pay attention to any imperfections of the apartment. But after a week, his schedule became more measured. He got used to a lot of things and slept much more sensitively. And one night, his sleep was disturbed by a measured sound. A drip, 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 drip. The annoying clatter of drops from the bathroom made Dima wake up and wiggle on the sofa. The old frame immediately creaked, making the guy cringe. Drip drop. Even through the thin blanket, Dima could hear every drop falling from the faucet to the bottom of the bathtub, as if a small hammer was tapping out its monotonous melody. The boy rose to his feet with a sudden movement and wandered into the hallway in the darkness, his hand barely touching the wall. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, smelling cool and damp. Flicking the switch, Dima stepped inside the tiny room, where an old cast-iron bathtub, an earthenware sink, and a toilet bowl barely fit. His feet were chilly from the icy tiles, and his whole body was instantly covered with goosebumps. It was as if the temperature in the bathroom was an order of magnitude lower than the rest of the apartment. The long faucet, with a slight patina of rust, shriveled and shabby, was turned towards the bathtub and counted drop by drop in a measured rhythm. Dima screwed the valves with all his might. The dripping became less, but the sound didn't seem to disappear. There was an unnerving pounding in my temples. Drip, drip, drip. The guy looked at the faucet with hatred. Condensation dripped from it, and a small puddle of rusty color formed on the floor. Having wiped it with a floor cloth, Dima turned the faucet to the sink and put a sponge under it, so that the knocking wouldn't disturb him to sleep, and then returned to the sofa. Already in the morning, sleepless and gloomy, taking a shower, he seriously thought about getting some more part-time work, just to save money, and as soon as possible to move out of this moldy and rusty stinking apartment. Pulling the curtain and stepping over the edge, Dima almost immediately noticed a huge reddish puddle, slowly and leisurely flowing from somewhere under the screen, which covered almost the entire space under the bathtub. The guy frowned and wiped up the water with a rag, but immediately new rusty rivulets ran along the tiles. "Oh crap, there's something else leaking in here," he thought indignantly. Kneeling down, Dima felt the plastic screen, finding a small door. Through it, he could hardly see anything in the dark space under the cast-iron bathtub. The whole space was cluttered with junk. A basin filled with old packages of powders and various cleaning agents stood in front. A mountain of rotten rags behind it, rusted paint cans, stale brushes, and paint rollers. In the darkness, it was hard to see all the garbage, which, to all appearances, had been stored under the bathtub for years, growing red flakes of rust, dust, cobwebs, and fungus. Dima went to his room to get his phone, turned on the flashlight and, returning to the bathroom, looked once more into the center of stench and dampness. He could only fit one hand through the small window of the screen. He could barely move his hand because of the cramped space, and of course he couldn't even see the pipes, the drain, or the leak. Suddenly, a vague shadow flashed in the weak light of the flashlight near the paint cans, which immediately disappeared when Dima jerked sharply. A muffled rustling of fabric was heard, and in a couple of moments, everything was silent again. The boy looked at the garbage for a few more minutes, trying to figure out if he had imagined it. But whoever lived under the bathtub clearly didn't want to be seen again. Rising to his feet and shaking off his knees, Dima quickly left the bathroom. He closed the door behind him especially tightly, and his fingers were already dialing his mother's number. "Hello?" "Yes." Heard in the receiver melodious mother's voice. "It's me." "Ah, son, you haven't called for a couple of days. Is everything all right? Have you settled in at the new place?" "Yeah, Mom." "Hey, can you tell me what kind of rat repellent you can use?" "Only effective." "Dima, have you got rats in your rented apartment?" Mom exclaimed in horror. "Rats or mice? I'm not sure exactly. Apparently, they were left by the previous tenants." "It's horrible. What kind of apartment is this in which rats live?" Mom breathed excitedly into the phone. "Did you talk to the landlady? This is just disgusting." "Ma," Dima raised his voice. "Calm down. Everything is normal." "What's normal here?" the mother started, but her son immediately interrupted her. "I don't have time. I have to be at school in half an hour. Just tell me some remedy to buy on the way." "Dima, I'm worried about you. I'm worried." "Ma, to business." The guy grumbled in a non-objectionable tone. Okay. We at the cottage with my grandmother did so. Took pumpkin seeds, inside with a syringe poured some liquid rat poison store, and then spread everywhere." "Why pumpkin seeds?" Dima was surprised. "Can't you just tell me the brand of poison? All these rodents love pumpkin seeds and smell them immediately, and since the odor is strong, the poison inside interrupts well. The rat grabs the seed, chews it without suspecting anything, and then dies after a while, and if you just put store poison everywhere, they will avoid it, that's all. These rats are very smart animals. They've known all the bad odors for a long time." "Did that idea of yours and your grandmother's ever work?" The boy doubted it. "Son, of course it did. We took out all the rats from the cottage. They avoided mousetraps, baits poisonous ignored, but against the seeds did not resist. I got it. Thanks, Ma. Dima hung up the phone without even saying goodbye, hurriedly packed and hurried to class. And in the evening, after studying and working, he ran to the store and bought everything he needed to hunt for the rat that was under the bathtub. He did as his mother had told him, spread the poisonous seeds behind the screen, and threw a handful into the darkness where the pile of rags lay. Then he closed the door tightly again, so that the dying rat could not escape from its tiled dungeon. Near midnight, about to go to bed, Dima went to wash his face. He cautiously opened the door, fearing to see a rat corpse there, but the floor was empty. No rat, no seeds. The boy hummed smugly to himself, glad that his victim had taken his bait. Now all he had to do was wait for the poison to take effect. Although maybe the rat had long ago died and stayed somewhere in a mountain of rags under the bathtub. This thought made Dima tense up. He didn't want to smell a rat corpse decomposing somewhere behind the screen for a couple more weeks. But there was no way to get all the garbage out from under the bathtub to find the rodent, because the plastic screen could not be moved or removed in any way. There was only a tiny window through which anything larger than a can of paint could hardly get through. While Dima was washing his face, looking at the rust on the faucet and pipes, which, as it seemed to him, suddenly became a little more than it was last night, somewhere downstairs under the bathtub, there was a barely audible rustling. The boy tensed momentarily, frozen in place with toothbrush in hand, but the rustling didn't happen again. He hastily finished brushing his teeth and rinsed his face. Gotta take a look after all. Maybe I'll see the corpse of that rat, Dima thought, squatting down. But he did not even have time to stretch his hand to the window in the screen, as the light went out in the room. Quite silently, the bathroom plunged into thick, inky darkness. And in the next moment, the oilcloth curtain rustled, as if someone was climbing on it to the top, clinging to the slippery surface with many paws. Dima shrieked and scrambled out of the room into the corridor, staring in horror at the darkening gap in the doorway. He jumped to his feet and flicked the light switch, but it didn't work. As he continued to pull the lever in despair, he kept his eyes on the curtain, where something heavy was definitely sitting. It also froze as if lurking. Dima slammed the door out of harm's way, fearing that the creature might have left the bathroom. He stood motionless in the corridor for a long time, listening to all the sounds coming from the room. A slight rustle of the curtain, then a muffled thud against the surface of the bathtub, and then only the monotonous clatter of drops. Dima only at that moment realized that before that the faucet had not leaked at all the whole evening, and now suddenly in 1 second it started again. Drip, drip. Drip, 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 like a ticking metronome. Armed with a phone with a flashlight on and a knife from the kitchen, Dima used the tip of the blade to pry the frame of the switch near the bathroom and removed it from the wall. The bright light of the smartphone for a moment highlighted in the darkness a tangle of wires covered in a thick red layer of corrosion. Jesus, how is it that, with such wiring, this apartment hasn't burned down yet? Marveled the guy, not even risking to touch anything unnecessarily. It's a good thing the lights only went out, but there could have been a fire. Carefully returning the switch to its place, Dima went to bed. He had nothing else to do. He had to get up early in the morning to study. An electrician had to be invited to replace the rusty wires, and he didn't want to go back to the bathroom again before morning. He decided to wait until the rat's agony was over. Because the fearlessness of the dying beast, rushing at the curtain, scared him to the point of goosebumps. In the morning, when the alarm clock rang, Dima forgot about all his night fears and opened the bathroom door without the slightest trembling in his hands. But the dead rat was gone again, but everywhere he looked there were paths of rusty water. The floor was covered with red puddles and dried streaks. The curtains were streaked with a dark ochre color, and the bottom of the sink and bathtub were filled with thin flakes of rust. There were traces of it everywhere. A light film in the corner of the mirror, between the tiles, and even on the plastic screen. If this rat isn't made of metal, I have absolutely no idea what happened here overnight. A troubled thought flashed through Dima's mind. The heavy metallic odor in the air irritated his sense of smell. The dripping of water was heard under the bathtub, a barely perceptible sound, distant and frightening. And then, almost immediately, something jumped from below onto the cast-iron bathtub and ran along it, making a distinct rustling and even crackling sound. Dima's hair stood on end with horror, and he ran out of the room under the incessant crackling. Now, having slammed the door, the boy without delay put a chair against it, so that, God forbid, the creature inside did not want to get out. It did not become calmer at all, and Dima could not explain to himself the nature of that creature that ran on the cast iron and left its rusty trace, smelling of metal and dampness. It was definitely out of the question to make another visit to the bathroom or to fight the rat on his own. If it was a rat, Dima rather packed up and cowardly ran away from home for the whole day, only having time to notice that in the evening it would be good to call the Sanitary Epidemiological Service to agree on the extermination of the pests in his bathroom. No money could be spared for such a thing. He was morally prepared even to tear out the plastic screen himself, without fear of the landlady's anger, just to become the sole tenant of the old apartment again. At school, the boy was absent-minded. The whole day he spent as if in a bad dream, constantly mentally returning to what happened at home. Strange rust stains did not go out of his head. At work, he was not very attentive either, and his worried mother called him and asked him if his son had managed to get the rats out of the apartment. Dima mumbled something unintelligible about ineffective ways of fighting rodents with pumpkin seeds and hung up. He had no desire to explain to his impressionable mother what strange things were going on at night in the rented one-room apartment. When Dima tiredly piled into the apartment after work, the first thing that attracted his attention was an overturned chair lying on the floor in the hallway, the same chair that the guy had propped up the bathroom door in the morning. The bathroom door was wide open, and there was a puddle of rusty water on the floor in front of it. It was everywhere. On the walls, rusty chrysanthemums coming through the wallpaper. On the door, individual drops were fanning across the ceiling, and wet paths went not only into the kitchen, but also into the living room. Dima's fingers went cold. He could hardly believe his own story about rats, because rodents could not climb the ceiling and spread rust stains everywhere. He returned the chair to its place, propping it against the door. There was no particular assurance, though, that the rats weren't behind the couch or the kitchen cabinet. Dima didn't even look into the darkening hole of the bathroom. He felt in his gut that it was not worth it. As if from there, from the darkness and dampness, something could look back at him. Sitting down at the kitchen table and glancing nervously at the locked bathroom door, he quickly looked up the number of some pest control service on the internet and dialed it. There were long, monotonous beeps. Dima drummed his fingers on the table in excitement. To distract himself, he grabbed a handful of pumpkin seeds, which were in the bowl in front of him and had been left over from the beginning of the rat hunt, and started snapping them, popping them into his mouth one by one. "Hello, you've reached the Sanitary Epidemiologic Service. Your call is very important to us. Please wait for the operator to answer," said the mechanical voice on the other end of the phone. The seeds tasted strange, too bitter, and for some reason they tasted slightly of metal. "There are no operators available right now. Your call is third in line." Dima chewed a few more before his mouth went numb. Trying to cough and spit out the seeds, he realized uneasily that he could no longer feel his own throat. Fingers digging into his skin, the boy began to roll his eyes in horror. "What's going on? It's hard to breathe." His gaze dropped casually down to where a broken vial of rat poison peeked out from under a chair, a yellowish stain spreading across the floor. Nearby were open syringes whose needles were covered with a layer of rust. It had all been in a different place before and clearly had a more coherent appearance. "Your call is second in line." The phone fell out of Dima's stiffened fingers, and the guy slowly fell from the chair, roughly putting his shoulder on the floor. The poison spread quickly through his body, penetrating into his blood, making his muscles stiffen, and even his voice was no longer under Dima's control. Your call is first in line. The chair that was propping up the door to the bathroom collapsed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The knob turned leisurely and the door opened slightly. Dima, writhing in agony, could see everything that was happening in the hallway. And when a dimensionless stain of rust grew on the doorknob in a flash and then swiftly moved down the surface of the door, the boy wanted to scream and shriek with horror. But no sound came out of his numb throat. The rust crept toward its immobilized victim, leaving a wet trail and thick red flakes that settled on all surfaces and immediately grew lush pockets of corrosion. The dark rust stain stretched in a wide strip along the corridor and came closer and closer to Dima's face, who was already losing his last vital forces. "Hello, my name is Valeria. How can I help you? Hello? Are you there? Call me back." Rust consumed everything, and everything became rust. The city of Voronezh, stop, House of the Architect, the former children's world, abandoned underground passage, for staircases connected by two wide concrete pipes. In the middle of one found the mangled corpse of a young man. During a search of the remains of his outer clothing, among other personal belongings, a 16-gigabyte flash drive with one text document, a letter to an unknown addressee, and several photographs were found. The text contained in the document is unabridged. The photographs are classified and cannot be published. The hardest part was thinking about everything and deciding to write this. A psychologist told me I should write when I get scared. Sorry for the weird start. I can't stop and think about what I've written. Time is getting short. The weirdest thing to do in my situation is to sit down at the computer and write about what happened, but I can't calm down otherwise. I'm pounding. My legs refuse to walk. I can't call you. I can't text you. I feel like I'm in danger of having my calls tapped and my internet access monitored. Believe me, I don't want to set you up and even less put you in danger, but I have to warn you, no matter what it costs me. You may remember that I have a door jamb peeking out from behind a closet at the end of the hallway. The thing is, before our family came here, some government official lived in this apartment. He punched a hole in the wall and connected the two apartments to maximize the living space. Then he went to jail. When we moved in, we welded the door shut. My mom was going to wallpaper it, but it didn't work out. And then when she and my dad died, I didn't care about that stuff. Don't laugh, I'm not being mystifying. The apartment on the other side of the door seems to be a bad one. The official was jailed shortly after the merger. That's the first thing. Two brothers, some kind of installers, lived there before him, and both of them hanged themselves on the same bar in the middle of the corridor a couple weeks after the move. That's the second thing. I don't know who lived there before them, but my downstairs neighbor says that there have been various stories about it since the early noughties. They say there's radioactive fittings buried in the wall, People walk, sleep, eat, and gradually go crazy and die. I also asked a grandmother I knew at the bus stop. She said that in the late 90s, some maniac held 3 street children there, chained them to 3 radiators in the room so that they could not reach each other, and left them to die. After all these stories, I felt uneasy. I walk along the corridor, squinting at that door, and everything in my chest is covered with frost. I bought an iron deadbolt in the hardware store. I fixed this iron to the door, for screw spoiled, but it seemed to be firmly planted. But it didn't help me. I look at this construction and, sometimes you look at a young mother with a stroller and then she stops for a second, takes her hand away to get a phone or scratch her nose, and you look at the stroller, which no one is holding, and your heart shrinks with horror. The mother seems to be near, a few centimeters away, but she's not holding the stroller. And here, everything seems to be in place, the welding seam, the latch, but it's like something's wrong. So I put a closet behind the door, stuffed it with junk for weight, and it seemed to ease up. And then last week, a couple days after we last saw each other, I heard someone banging on the door. It was in the morning. I just opened my eyes, woke up before my alarm clock, and there was something pounding on the door. I was definitely sewn to the sheet. I couldn't even move. I thought to myself that this evil from the empty apartment was hungry and came to me. And then I heard first a loud cough and then conversations. I let go, figured the evil apartment had gotten new tenants. But here's the thing. I hear voices and a nasty cough, whistling and wet at the same time. But I can't make out the words, and then I couldn't. It was as if I was dying of dementia. The sounds were familiar, the intonations were familiar, and the audibility was good, but I couldn't understand the meaning of the phrases. The same day, I met a neighbor who lives across the stairwell and asked her if she knew anything about the new tenants. She just shrugged her shoulders and went downstairs. And in the evening, when I came home from work, while I was looking for my keys in my pocket, I looked at the neighbor's door by accident, and just imagine, at that very moment, as I turned my head, someone laughed from the other side. It was mocking, like he was trying to scare me, and I foolishly laughed back, also with such a sinister intonation. Suddenly, the iron door rattled for another 5 seconds. I was sweating. I almost bit my lip from horror, quickly opened my door and locked myself from inside. Then I calmed down a little, but I still had a bad feeling because after all, I'd lived here longer than them, and the newcomers, were scaring me. I jumped out of bed in the middle of the night. Believe me, I'm writing this now, and my fingers are freezing. You can't even imagine how scared I am. I wish I hadn't gone crazy. In the middle of the night, I jumped out of bed, and I don't understand what happened. In my head, at once a quiet hoarse whisper reminded me of the golden rule that if you wake up at night without a reason, then someone is looking at you. And I couldn't see anything at all. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see my own hands. I started patting my cheeks, and they were covered in goosebumps. My forehead is in sweat, my throat is dry, and my soul is on fire. I feel that I'm going to wail with horror, but I'm even more afraid to make a sound. And then there's laughter right underneath me. Oh God, I am now all cold. It's terrible to write this, from top to toe like needles. Imagine how I felt that night. Quiet laugh, but still mocking. I hit the floor, fell unluckily. My knee hit the wall, but I got over it. I jumped to the light switch, slammed it, thinking that the creature would be right in my face. But the room was empty, not a soul except for me, all wet and shivering like in the cold. So I thought about the situation. I couldn't understand how someone could laugh under me. I have a prefabricated bed. Remember? No base, mattress on particle board, and they're on 3 legs. There's no way to get under me except by lifting the mattress and slipping through the cracks. So I'm standing there, thinking about it, and I feel my knees start to shake. Apparently, my subconscious has already figured it out, but I haven't had time to follow it yet. And suddenly, like a burned man, I ran out of the bedroom, grabbed a knife in the kitchen, and huddled in the corner. I thought that the laughing ghoul had lifted the bed, climbed under it, and then it hit the floor, which woke me up. I sat in the corner for about 10 minutes, if not more, and then on woozy legs I went to the front door, checked the locks, made sure everything was locked. I slipped into the living room, turned on the music on the computer so that I wouldn't be scared, and went with a firm step with a knife in my hand straight after the monster. Barely lifted the bed and mattress, but found no one. The next night I invited Larissa to visit. She brought her corgi with her. She said, "Let him run around while we watch a movie." I kept thinking whether to tell her about the night or not. She'd think I was some kind of coward, but I decided to. She immediately calmed me down, said that often at the boundaries of sleep, when almost asleep or just awake, people hear different sounds. For example, if you think of your grandfather calling you by name, you hear his voice clearly. Or you remember the melody of the alarm clock and shudder at it, even though the room is silent. I've got laughter imprinted in my memory. And you know what? It's been a relief. I had already cursed myself 3 times for the fact that instead of acting, I was spinning on the spot like a weather vane, becoming paranoid or fearless rationalist. But unfortunately, the calm didn't last long. We were sitting in front of the TV in the living room when Larissa's corgi brought an eye in its teeth. I took a picture of it. It's not a prop or a similar piece of chicken, but a real eye, and the dog's face was covered in blood. We thought he had hurt himself, but he didn't even whimper. He put this abomination next to us and sat down next to us. Larissa, in a panic, dragged the pet to the bathroom, washed, wiped, once again examined whether there were no wounds. In the meantime, I could not find a place to myself as a wounded man ran around the apartment, in all corners looked, and as if an unknown force I was confused, you just think, did not bother to check behind the closet in the hallway. I don't remember what I said to Larissa, apologizing for something, looking for an explanation, but my thoughts were confused and my tongue was slurred. I walked her to the bus stop, and as soon as I came back, I went to the closet as if I'd had an epiphany. And there's blood all over the welded door. Don't think I'm confused or nervous. All the photos are on the flash drive. And the blood isn't stained. It's oozing out of the cracks in the sides. I must have cramped up. I reached for the brass knob in disgust, yanked, and the door gave way. There was no welding seam, but now there was a trickle of red, something stuck and squelching in the bottom crack. It was rotten bits of meat, and I somehow doubt very much that it belonged to any known animal. And the damn door, it seemed so flimsy and unreliable. It was only the deadbolt I had put on it that kept out the filth that was trying so hard to get into my apartment from the other side. And that smell. It was the stench of meat left in a cellophane bag for a week. The stench made my temples ache, and viscous streams of vomit rumbled in my chest. I rushed to the computer, wanting to write to Larissa. The guilt eating me up from the inside was intermingled with a soul-scorching horror. It was very uncomfortable that her dog could have been poisoned by rotten meat planted by the neighbors, but at the same time I understood that to worry about it in my position. Unspeakable stupidity. I moved the mouse. The monitor lit up, and what I saw broke something inside me. On the screen, in big letters, it read, "Remove the lock, bastard." I believe those who claim to have turned gray with horror overnight. It was as if an electric current had been passed through my hair, and I shook like a condemned man in the electric chair. In a fit, I dropped the keyboard from the table, broke the mug of coffee I'd finished drinking, twisted like a wounded man in the stomach, and almost choked on the lump in my throat. The phone rang like ammonia on me. Pulling myself together, I picked up the receiver, not even noticing that the call was from a hidden number. A quiet, elderly voice in an orderly tone muttered, "Don't you dare call anyone, asshole." I didn't finish listening, dropped the call, and with trembling fingers dialed 02. There was a beeping, then the unpleasant clatter of the receiver hitting the plastic case, and then I heard a voice, "I told you, don't you dare, asshole." The words flew into my head like a bullet. I could hardly get up, went out into the hallway, took my jacket, wanted to leave the apartment, but when I took the key, I heard laughter in the entrance. If I could go back to the past and give myself a ringing slap, to drive away from the peephole, not to let me see that mind-tearing creature that occupied the stairwell. God, I dread to think of this embodiment of ugliness. I may be wrong about the details, but it's impossible to be wrong about the outline. Colorful yellow pipes covered with black feathers and wriggling like earthworms stretched from the neighboring apartment to a large, door-sized, furry lump. From this epicenter of the abomination sprouted thin, fly-like legs and brown, curved outgrowths that looked like charred stumps of human hands. The whole thing wriggled, shook, curled into impossible shapes and stretched, emitting black smoke. I still wish I'd taken a picture of it. I turned away from the peephole and rushed to the other end of the corridor to check the deadbolt, when suddenly I found that my face and hands were covered with a disgusting gray film that looked like milk foam. I peeled it off, threw it on the floor, and ran to the deadbolt. The door, whistling with blood-smeared hinges, was jangling back and forth. The deadbolt still held, but the pair of self-tapping screws holding it in place were already gleaming at the top of the threads, as if to tell me that I couldn't linger in the apartment any longer. But where could I go? After all, the horrible degenerate was still laughing in the stairwell. So I barricaded both doors and locked myself in the living room, sat down at my computer, and started writing this. I promise I'll try to find some way to seal this nightmare as soon as possible and keep it from spreading any further. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Just make sure you save the pictures. My apartment is already filled with the damned miasma of this nasty stuff that leaked from the neighboring apartment. But I feel that while I'm writing, stuck to the monitor, they can't get to me. It makes it easier to relive the nightmare around me. Now I intend to save everything, climb out the window onto the roof of the store, jump to the ground. And, it's like I can feel that I'm being guarded under the windows. That laughing freak will definitely come after me. There's no doubt about it. But I've figured out a way to confuse him. I'm gonna run across the road in the crosswalk. All I have to do is make up my mind. I'll drop the flash drive in your mailbox. And if you're reading this right now, I did it, and not all is lost.